Yes. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thumbs up across the board there. All right. Well, good morning and thank you for having me as a guest in your house, your virtual house of worship this morning. It's good to be back. Making the transition from musician to speaker. This morning's sermon is entitled Seeing the Unseen. Last year, in early April, a new bird showed up in our backyard. It was perched on a tree outside my bedroom window, and it sat there for a while, bobbing its tail and preening itself. So I got my binoculars and studied it for a few minutes. It was black and gray, and it had a long tail. I thought it might be a flycatcher of some sort. So I got out my Sibley bird guide, and sure enough, it was an eastern phoebe. And I pointed out this new bird to my wife and son, and we all just kind of stood and wondered at it for a while. Next morning, we could hear it singing, "Phoebe, Phoebe, Phoebe," which kind of sounded like "feed me, feed me, feed me." And we could see, and eventually, it built a nest on top of the light on our front porch. Now, we could see this nest from the side window of our garage without disturbing the birds. So every day we watched Mama Phoebe sitting on her nest and marveled at the wonderful web of existence of which we are a part. Eventually, over time, the eggs hatched, and we watched the babies go from little balls of fluff to fledglings flapping their wings and barely fitting in the nest. There were 3 of them in there. And one day in mid-May, I happened to be outside and I walked by the nest, and one of the birds squeaked and flew away out of the nest to a perch and perched on the cedar siding of the house. And when I walked by again a few minutes later, the other 2 were gone as well. And they never came back. I guess I got to see them fledge. I got to see them leave the nest. Wow. And this made me wonder, had I just seen the unseen? Now, the natural world has always enchanted and enthralled me. Even as a kid growing up on the north side of Chicago, my dad taught at Loyola University's Lakeshore campus, so we lived about half a block from Lake Michigan. The lake was this vast, mysterious thing. And as a kid, in the summer, I spent most of my time swimming in its waters and playing in the sand. In the wintertime, the lake became this big, scary, frozen thing that you didn't want to get too close to. If you walked out on that ice, you might just disappear. And the northeast wind would come howling in off the lake and bury the city with snow. It made me feel very small in comparison. Even when we moved to the suburbs away from the lake, I would always return wherever I could. When I got old enough to drive, I would borrow my parents' car and spend hours driving along the north shore of the lake, looking for secluded places to hide from the pressures of my life. I would look at the big houses and dream of living on the water one day. Now, it was this connection to the natural world that inspired me to enlist in the United States Coast Guard in 1976. After boot camp, I was stationed at a small boat search and rescue station in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. I immediately fell in love with the ocean. My next duty station after some training was Kodiak, Alaska. Now, in the 70s, there were 14 miles of paved road and 1 stop sign on the entire island of Kodiak. This was before anybody ever thought of bringing a cruise ship to Alaska. Kodiak wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from there. It rained so much we called it liquid sunshine. Kodiak was also home of the world's largest bear. I mean, you knew from the minute you got there you were no longer at the top of the food chain. But it wasn't until I got stationed in Kodiak, Alaska, that I realized I was part of something much greater. I was enchanted by the untamed wilderness around me. Beautiful wild mountains surrounded by the ocean. I started to wonder about God with a capital G. I flew on big propeller-driven C-130 aircraft out along the chain of the Aleutian Islands. I saw places few people will ever venture. I saw the midnight sun in the summer and the northern lights in the long, dark winter. This got me wondering if maybe we humans were not the center of the universe after all. Perhaps we're just a part of something much bigger. I got out of the service in '79, found myself back in Chicago getting a degree in computer science, living in that lakefront neighborhood I grew up in. And I had this little 600 square foot apartment right on the lake, a block over from the street I grew up on. So I got married, and we moved to a house in the suburbs, and we woke up one morning and realized how much we hated it, how much we missed the connection with the natural world. Eventually, we quit our jobs, sold that house in the suburbs, and moved to North Carolina, to where I am now, in a rural, or I'd say semi-rural area of Chatham County, which is getting a little less rural every day. So we live in a modest home on about 7 acres of woods. We got no lawn to mow, just deer, birds, lots of squirrels, and the occasional bobcat or coyote. I can't see any of my neighbors' houses. One day I was feeling restless, and I decided I needed a hobby. Well, why not bird watching? I mean, I was already an avid hiker, and a mountain biker, so it seemed like bird watching would dovetail nicely into this. So I invested in a couple of bird books and got a nice pair of binoculars. The binoculars were made by a company called Swarovski. I noticed the motto on their website and their packaging, "Seeing the Unseen." As a Unitarian Universalist and an observer of nature, that really struck a chord in me, seeing the unseen. So I started paying more attention to the birds in my backyard. I identified the most abundant species. You can see them in your backyards or when you're walking in a park anywhere in this area. Carolina chickadee, tufted titmouse, cardinal, and a variety of nuthatches. And I got to know the songs of the year-round residents in my backyard bird feeder. So when a new bird showed up and I heard a new song, I would be alerted by it. I'd go, "Ooh, who's that singing in my backyard? Ooh, I need to write that down. Who's that singing in my backyard? I may have to write a song." That'd be a good title for a song. Okay, sorry, sidetrack. One day I was watching a wood thrush foraging in the leaves in the underbrush, and it felt like a sacrament. It felt like a holy thing, a direct connection to the wonder of the natural world. Again, I felt this uncentering, this feeling of not being at the center of everything. This connection seemed to come from seeing something previously unseen. A new way of seeing things. Something I had to look for. Once you train yourself to notice things like wildlife, it can lead to greater situational awareness, a greater awareness of the people around us. All right, now hold on to that thought for a while, and I'm going to switch gears on you here. Now, I'm wondering how many of you out there know what it's like to feel like you're invisible. This is from what I understand, a lot of people have come and talked to me about this when they've heard that song "Invisible," and they said, "Yeah, I know what it's like to feel invisible." My most memorable experience of feeling invisible was as a wayward teenager. I was 16 years old and I hitchhiked across the country, all the way from my comfortable middle-class suburban existence in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, all along Route 66 to the West Coast. I went up through California where I ran out of money in Portland, Oregon. I guess you could say I was homeless. All I know is I was living on the street. I would sleep in my good old dependable U.S. Army surplus down sleeping bag in one of the numerous county parks. It was actually pretty safe. in Portland back in those days. In the morning, I would go down to town and panhandle the morning commuters to try to get enough money so I could eat. Excuse me. But nowadays, decades later, the thing that stays with me most about this is how so many people would walk right past me like I wasn't even there, like I was invisible. I was unseen. Now we all have these invisible people in our lives. You know, they sometimes they cook our food in a restaurant. Sometimes they bag our groceries. Sometimes they clean the bathrooms in the office where we work. Some of them stand at intersections with cardboard signs. You know, the Christmas after the last presidential election, I treated myself with a Spanish language course on CD. I was sick and tired of hearing all this talk about building walls and decided I was going to build some bridges. So I started learning the language, and now and again I tried to speak it. Now, back when I was in corporate IT, there was this Hispanic woman who cleaned the bathrooms in this Cube Farm office building that I worked at. And it always bugged me that everybody walked right by this person. No one ever said hello. No one even smiled at her. She was invisible to the mostly white, affluent corporate types that I worked with. One day she was pushing her cart down the hall, and I stopped and said, "Buenos dias, señora." And she paused for a moment, and a transformation seemed to occur. She was all of a sudden taller and more dignified, and she made a show of looking at her watch, and then looked me straight in the eye and said, "Es tardes, señor." Which basically saying, I had said good morning and it was 3 p.m. So she was saying, basically, thank you for acknowledging me, but if you're going to speak my language, get it right. This was a humbling experience, okay? I always check my watch before I initiate a conversation in Spanish anymore. But the important thing was that I made an effort. I crossed class, race, I crossed a class, race, and language line that most of my peers in corporate America could not be bothered with. It was a small thing, and it was a good thing. And again, yes, it was humbling. Now, this doesn't make me any sort of hero. Please, don't go there. It makes me more aware of the privileged life that I lead. As I was discussing this episode with my minister, Reverend Tom Belote, he called me on this. He said that she is not invisible to her family. She's not invisible to the people she works with, the other people on her team or her supervisor. Reverend Tom also said something that I like to remember. He said that when you engage someone like this, there are times when it's going to be uncomfortable. He likes to say, you know, we're dancing when I'm stepping on your feet. I'm still processing that. Now, as a Unitarian Universalist and a seer of the unseen, I try to get engaged across lines I could just as easily ignore. As an affluent white person, I could sit comfortably on my butt for the rest of my life and ignore it all. But there's so many people in America that don't have that option. Another one of my Spanish-speaking adventures actually turned out pretty well. I used to eat at a Jersey Mike's sub place once a week in the Research Triangle. And I always had the same sandwich, and I would banter with the crew as I was moving through the line and they were putting the toppings on it. And one day they hired a Latina woman. Turns out she was from Mexico. Excuse me. And every time I went through the line, I would check my watch, and I would greet her accordingly in Spanish. Buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas tardes. And we would banter back and forth a little bit in Spanish, and she would teach me the words for the toppings that would go with the sandwich and things like that. One day, the manager was out on a catering delivery, and she was running the register. And it came time to ring up my sandwich, and the register rang up, no charge. And I looked up with my cash in my hand, puzzled, and she just winked at me. I put a $5 bill in the tip jar, and I went back to work thinking, bridges, not walls. So who are the invisible people in your lives? Is it the person with the cardboard side standing on the median of the highway or the ramp of the interstate? How about the person bagging the groceries or the checkout person? You know, you can't help bag your own groceries. How about the musicians at the farmer's market? But the more I notice, the more uncomfortable I get. Sometimes I get the impression that some folks are trying to stay invisible as a survival mechanism. But the first principle, my belief in the worth and dignity of all persons, makes me want to build bridges with the people that I encounter daily who may be living in the margins. Many are working service jobs. Now, Dale Carnegie, in his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, says, and I quote, "Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language." So if I'm in a restaurant and the server's not wearing a name tag, I will ask them their name. I want to call them by their name. I don't want to say, "Oh, sir, miss, hey, you, waitress." I want to humanize that interaction. I want to call this person by their name. In July of 2018, I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I damn near died. I spent 3 weeks in the oncology ward at UNC Hospital. And I hate hospitals. I was so lonely there, even though friends and family came to see me every day. So I made sure that I talked to everybody that came in my room. I knew the names of the nurses. I knew the certified nursing assistants. Oh Lord, those people work hard. I knew the name of the people who cleaned my room. I knew the guy who drove the big the big floor buffing machine down the hallway. I knew the names of his 3 kids. I talked to him every day. I was so grateful just to be alive. I was trying to connect with everyone who supported me in any way. At meal times in the hospital, though, the food trays came up from the kitchen in these big insulated robot carts called tugs. And there was an African-American gentleman who brought my breakfast to my room every weekday morning. Now, he was quite a dapper man, and he wore a bow tie. And I could tell he had pride in what he was doing. So one morning, he wasn't wearing a name tag, so one morning I asked him what his name was. And as he slid the tray of food onto my stand next to my bed, he kind of looked away from me and just said, "Antoine." Kind of said it under his breath. And from that morning, I would always greet him enthusiastically, "Antoine, good morning, how's it going, man?" And it occurred to me after a couple of days that I was making Antoine uncomfortable. He was not comfortable with these interactions. Why? Maybe he was trying to be invisible to the people he served on purpose. Perhaps it was a defense mechanism that helped him survive. I know that a cancer hospital can be a pretty grim place to work. And I really didn't know what he was up against in his job or at home. Now, eventually they sent me home from the hospital, and I endured months of outpatient chemotherapy treatment. I've come out the other side with a second chance at life. And I'm feeling stronger every day. It's a life that keeps me asking myself that wonderful question from Mary Oliver's poem, A Summer Day. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? A life that's given me the opportunity to stand and sit before you today, even across the internet, and sing for you and challenge you to see the unseen and to build bridges, not walls, to not turn away from the uncomfortable things you may see. Amen. Thank you, and may it be so.